So we have plenty of time for questions and comments from all of you. So I think if people can go to a microphone and be prepared to make a question or comment. And as we're waiting for folks, I thought I might kick off with the initial question. Everyone on the panel talked about having patients participating in advance of being subjects in research, whether it's co-design or, Will, you talked about getting the patients engaged at the get-go. And it seems to me that it is popular today. It's sort of a buzzword today: patient engagement, patient participation, patient-centered. And we all, I think, share a commitment to that in the design phase. But I'm wondering if you have observations about the existence or the need for real evidence about how to do that well. So I think each of you have your own experiences, but I'm wondering to what extent might trials and methodologies and tools formerly known as virtual be helpful in really being able to collect the kind of evidence that we need to know what works and what doesn't work, so that we can design studies that are meaningful and can recruit and retain participants well. So I'm sort of throwing out a broad question there.
Well, I would mention that at the Fox Foundation, and I'm a volunteer to the Fox Foundation. I'm not employed by the Fox Foundation. So what we tend to do is try and prepare language early on in regards to our patient engagement to make sure that the patients feel that they're part of something bigger than just spewing data into their computer or their phone. We recently kind of launched a beta tester program so that we have this Fox Insight website that's a behemoth that has all these participants and all this participation that's ongoing, and people don't drop it very much. But what we need to do, we realize we need to communicate with them and find out how their experience is all the way along. We don't want to wait until we're looking at, okay, from quarter 3 to quarter 4, we saw a drop here. Why did that happen? We don't want to do that. So we do everything we can to talk about the questions we ask, how we ask them, what the UI looks like, what's the patient experience like. It's a quality control method that we realize is ongoing, and it starts with a lot of times with language. Like, we got this beta tester group. So my suggestion was, let's not call them a beta tester group, because my mythical subject is Myrna and Sheboygan. I always say Myrna and Sheboygan. So if we tell Myrna and Sheboygan she's a member of the beta tester group, what does that mean? Does that mean I have to change my VCR? Do I have to go back to the old little tiny tapes? What does that mean?
Why am I not alpha?
Right. If we tell them that you're now part of the team, oh, that's awesome. I'm on a team with Michael J. Fox, who I know from Back to the Future. That's cool. I can tell my people at my support group about it, and they can tell people about it. And next thing you know, Myrna from Sheboygan has the Milwaukee chapter of some other foundation going to Fox Insight. So it's a process where we try and think our way through ahead of time.
So we have been in the process of developing, and they're close to becoming more public, 2 tools. One is a tool that we call the Patient Trial Experience Survey, and something that people who join, patients like me, are asked within a certain period of time after joining. We've been doing it now for a number of years, and it asks questions about their experience of having ever been asked to participate in a clinical trial. 68% of the people consistently have never been asked, so that's one important piece. But for those who have been asked or who have participated, then we go into further detail to get additional experience information about what that experience was like, whether they would suggest that other people who they care about might do it. So we have a lot of data from that survey. And then the other is Trial Mark, and this is something we've been developing with a couple of industry partners over the last couple of years. It will be made more available in 2019, and that is actually for trialists to use and industry to use to gauge the experience of the participants that are in their studies, to determine how centric has it been, what involvement they have had. And I think it will be an important tool as it gets released out into the wild in 2019 to have better understanding of being able to benchmark how well some trials are doing against how not well others are doing. So, and giving patients a voice and being able to measure that.
Great. Silas?
Yeah, I'd piggyback on both of those, and Will in particular. It's the messenger, right? Sometimes that's more important than the message. Who's doing the asking, right? So my mom, she's no longer with us, but back in the day, my daughter became a vegan, my son became vegetarian, and I said, "Mom, we're going to cut back on red meat." And she said, "Okay." And she bites her burger, right? Right? So, 2 months later, the pastor says, "As a church body, we are going to cut back on red meat." So my mom comes home and says, "You know what? I think we're going to cut back on." I said, "Mom, I said we're going to don't eat the burger." She says, "No, but the pastor said." Okay, and so it's the messenger, right? In many regards, who's doing the asking that counts, and if you trust who's doing the asking, perhaps you're going to be a little bit more likely to listen to that person.
Well, just to add, the traditional approach that I have used is an iterative approach with usability testing and focus groups and going back and forth till we perfect the design of an app or an intervention. Another approach that we might consider is crowdsourcing with platforms like mTurk, for example. Of course, it depends on the disease or the intervention. So something like physical activity, we can get input from a lot more people than it is for if it's an intervention for maybe smokers. So we want smokers, or something even more specific like ALS. But crowdsourcing is becoming more and more popular for some of these feedback on a large scale. From a large scale of people.
Good morning. I'm Cindy Gagan, and I'm a longtime patient advocate and cancer survivor. But I also represent CITI, the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative effort looking at mobile clinical trials, and I co-lead the stakeholder engagement part of that. And so as part of that work, we surveyed 400 potential research participants. They were predominantly white, highly educated, because it was a volunteer survey. But a couple of things that came out of there didn't really come up here. One was that people want their data returned, 98% of them in almost real time. And I know that could mess up randomization, but we need to think about that, because I've been in this field for longer than engagement was cool, and we used to use words like empower. So giving people some information to empower them, to engage them, to continue to do things could be helpful. The other thing that came out of there, but it was really small, but I know from my experience in supporting cancer patients, is the need to see somebody, for a physician or a provider to look at you, to tell you you're okay, you're not at risk from this intervention. It's just like you look forward to those visits, so somebody looks at you. So that's also part of that sharing both ways. But it's important. And the other part that actually I was at the meeting that the workshop out there was peer-to-peer works really well. We found that really a lot in breast cancer, is having somebody who's been in a trial talk to somebody else who's thinking about it, just so you know your hair's not going to go on fire when you go home with that device. I mean, that really helps a lot.
Just a brief commercial break for Academies study and this point of return of results. There is a recent Academy report that makes the recommendation that research results and individual research results be returned to research participants, which is a substantial sort of reflection of the cultural shift from paternalism in medicine and research to partnership. Valerie, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Valerie Barton. I'm an advisor with Faster Cures. I have a two-part question for Mr. Buchanan. The first is that you use the platform and you've built the networks to reach out and recruit people for various and sundry initiatives. How do you communicate once something is sort of finished with an individual? How is it communicated back? And I also wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the use of data and how it's aggregated and if it's analyzed and how that figures in overall to the outreach and maybe tweaking the outreach or kind of helping you identify high-value partners.
So as we are just really pushing off the dock on a lot of our work, the data, and the young lady there from CTTI, that's exactly right. At the community level, people are looking for their data and wanting their data. You have to have a mechanism to actually receive it, right? So being able to take large chunks of data and give it back to community organizations, whether it's through a survey or a poll, and we've done surveys and polls around infant mortality, and we've shared that data back with community-facing organizations. We don't dictate how they use it. Our hope is that they're actually going to use that data to make a greater ask, as I mentioned in my talk, of a local foundation that can provide them with more funding for their particular mission. We do hold on to the data in aggregate. We haven't done anything with it. We haven't done a ton of campaigns to date, but we haven't done anything with it. And our goal is not necessarily in the near term to monetize that data. We would need a whole heck of a lot of it for that to make any sense. But we do want to analyze it for trends, right? We do want to take a look at what's happening almost block by block. We do want to find ways to mash that data up and perhaps share it back with patient permission with claims data and EMR data. We are keenly interested in capturing social determinants of health data and finding ways to integrate that back into the clinical record. And we think that holds value for patient consumers as well as community healthcare providers and systems. So we're still kind of newbies as it relates to kind of capturing the data and figuring out what exactly we'll do with it. But we have heard through focus groups directly from patient consumers that they want their data back in real time. Our issue is how do you get it? How do you get it to them? So did I answer your question?
Make this one point. One thing that we have done over the years is that whenever we're working with an external researcher, that we actually develop a give back, well, even with our own internal research, but we always have a give back plan as part of the research design so that we think about it right from the beginning, and we are incorporating that into the plan as to not just beyond a publication that would go into a journal, but what actually people can get in their hands or on their profile in some way, in an aggregate or individual way. But I think if you build it in, then there's much more likelihood that you will actually act on that. So,
yeah, one more thing. Again, kind of back to the trust as a factor, and having that mechanism that patient consumers will trust and use, right, to share and receive data back and forth from any source is important. So whether it's an electronic personal health record that is branded in a way that gives them comfort that what I share is going to be used the right kind of way and not necessarily exploited, and that it's a two-way street, and I'm able to, through this same channel, receive information back that's positively going to help me and or my family. I think when we can solve for that, we're going to make hay.
Can I just add one thing? It's important that we return the data back, but sometimes this can mess up the randomization so as long as I think at the orientation session when we're recruiting people and bringing in cohorts, we can explain randomization, and there are actually tutorials that will explain randomization 101 in a very simple way and have actually help with retention. We can explain why we will be returning data in real time or not, depending on the study that we are looking at. And I think as long as patients or participants know that in the end they will be getting some sort of feedback, I think that is important.
But actually setting that up in the real world is very complicated. I work with the Children's Oncology Group, and it's taken us 10 years to get our return of results committee focusing, and we actually have maybe 6 postings returning results, real live. So yes, it's a great idea. I wonder how we can make it work in real time. It's very.
Can I just add one other thing, which I think is really important here, because I think to Shireen's point, it is important that we help participants understand the value of not sort of exposing certain things. But I think we've, in the past, we've gone way too far to keep people in the dark and not illuminating at least something, because the genie is out of the bottle. People will actually be putting in their profiles on our site, for example, their ID number for their drugs study that they're on, and monitor their symptoms and monitor different ways of being able to know how they're doing and whether or not, gee, I think I'm not on the drug, that guy's doing better than me. So I think we need to pay attention to that. What we've done in addressing that is really helping people understand that you will get something back. There will be a way of being able to give you some information to keep you so that you're not in the dark, but at the same time, the integrity of the trial will depend on you being sure that we're not exposing things that would be inappropriate. So it's kind of a balance there.
The middle, Steve?
A couple of issues. We design a lot of trials with NIH money, and the most common issue that we face when we start designing trials in incorporating a diverse population is that, of course, NIH requires that you show that you're recruiting a diverse population, and what's usually meant is more or less a representative sample of the underlying demography. But the big question we face is whether or not there's a biological reason that the responses in one group will differ from the responses in another group. And if we think that that's true, if there's a biological reason for it, then just representing the underlying population is not sufficient. As you suggested, if there's a difference in the way Hispanics respond as opposed to whites because of some underlying biology, you need to have enough in both of those groups, sometimes equal numbers, in order to understand that. Otherwise, at the end of the study, you may have diversity, but it's often just meaningless from the biological mechanism, what you're doing. So that's a tough decision at the start. But just diversity and representativeness of a population is sometimes just window dressing for a trial. What you really need to understand, you really need to design the trial we do, as to whether or not you need enough to be able to compare, the groups. That's the first comment. Response.
Those tables that you have to prepare as you're submitting your application of your target recruitment and then in your progress reports. It's actually sort of astonishing when I went for my second tour of duty at NIH to learn that data was not being aggregated, examined, assessed, utilized in any way at all.
Right.
It was just droppingly stunning, So you're exactly right. And to know whether or not there's likely to be a biological hypothesis, biological difference that you could hypothesize and therefore design your study to be sufficiently powered to examine that, really then relies on the preclinical data and whether or not there were animals that were included that represented some sort of diversity, right? Yeah. And then that policy flies directly in the face of minimize the number of animals used in studies. So it's all these sort of woven together, complicated norms here, but you're quite right, yeah.
So that's, I think, the first question, we're talking about diversity in the study for us is, do we need to have power to compare racial or demographic groups? Do we need that power? And if you do, it increases the number you need to recruit. And it has an impact on expense and design, and it makes the kind of things you're talking about, which how do we engage and bring those people in, even more important. And if it's just representativeness and that's all we care about, it's an easier target to hit. Let me add one other type of representativeness that hits us a lot, studying Parkinson's and aging, is that the group that needs to be better represented in all these are people with the more severe forms of the condition. Sort of regardless of demography, that's a representativeness that really is important and hard to achieve. And maybe where these kinds of trials where they can be done at home has a real benefit, because if I were thinking about what needs to be representative in our populations, it's the degree of severity of the condition, because people may respond quite differently, and those most severe may be the ones who are most likely to benefit. We don't know. So on the list of diversity, I'd really like to pitch for diversity in the stage or severity of the condition you're looking at as really important to understanding who should get it, later on. And then the last thing, and I'm going to shut up and sit down for the rest of the meeting.
What I would say for
go ahead. Sorry.
What I would say for the Fox Foundation is we invest a lot of energy in not only speaking to the patient, but speaking to the caregiver as well. We want caregivers to participate because I'm very lucky. I found a drug that minimizes my symptoms and widens my on time greatly. A lot of people haven't found that chance or haven't had that opportunity yet. So what we realize is a lot of those people who have it more severely need help, and they have a caregiver who can provide that data, someone who's there 24/7 next to them who can provide that data, because we realize that's valuable too. So unpacking that and having that as a reference point is very, very important to us. So when we say, come be a part of Fox Insight, we say patients and caregivers and even people who don't have Parkinson's come participate as well. We want to aggregate as much data as possible, but the caregivers always mentioned. It's very important because that helps the people with the more severe cases input data as well.
Bill, I really like that's an important point because we don't get very many people with cognitive impairment in our studies for treatments that might actually be either work differently or really most beneficial. And it's hard. So getting a caregiver or partner and thinking about how to engage people with impairments that would make it hard to participate, I think is and it's one of the things we know through the Parkinson's work that caregivers are easier to identify. But and then the last thing, there's another vehicle for making that needs to be representative in the sample studies we do. We can get patients involved in the beginning and designing all that kind of stuff. It's cool. I just got the list of the Data Safety Monitoring Board for our big Parkinson's trial. There's not a patient on it. And I haven't, in about a dozen trials where we've had Data Safety Monitoring Boards, I can't remember one that had a patient representative. Everyone has to have an ethicist. Every one of those boards has to have a statistician. None of them are required to have a patient representative in monitoring how the recruitment goes and just what's happening to people during the trial. And so, I don't know, Clay, if the document could just have one line in it saying DSMBs, participant representatives, it might help make access and patient, quote, centeredness, more of a real thing.
One thing I would add to that is that, I think it's totally ridiculous that there wouldn't be, but I also want to caution us to suggest that one person on a panel is not necessarily going to be fully representative or, bring that diversity of the severity of disease that you want to get. So one of the things that we've done with the patient-focused drug development meetings that were held at the FDA, for every one of the conditions where we had a community of size, we actually created a retrospective review of all the data we had, and Parkinson's was one that we did a lot of work in. We had about 6,000 profiles we could pull data from. We also did a prospective survey asking the specific questions that FDA was interested in, and we also did a full analysis of the qualitative data we had and brought the three together, as opposed to 100 people in the room anecdotally talking about what their daily life was like with Parkinson's. We were able to be quite data-driven. And then to your other point, I think I would say that our feasibility study with the Duke ALS Clinic with Lunison demonstrated quite well that you can get a much more diverse population, even though it may not be diverse with race and ethnicity, but you get a more diversity across the spectrum of disease, and we saw that quite a bit in the, and that will build on that in the next phases of that work. So I agree with you totally on that.
One quick comment before our last question over here. On the data safety monitoring issue, I am the ethicist on, I don't even want to tell you how many of those committees. I sat on one with a patient advocate, the Central IRB for Cancer. Fabulous. Yeah. Couldn't have been more helpful. Jaw-droppingly different in how that organization worked. So I totally support that, just from my own personal experience.
Can I just add one more comment, adding complexity to what you said about representativeness? So NIH, basically, we go by the designated racial ethnic categories, but there are calls now to disaggregate some of the groups that we tend to kind of lump together because of, let's say, look at smoking rates, for example. There are variations among Latinos, even though we categorize them as Latinos. The non-Latino other, which is like includes Pacific Islanders and Alaska Natives and so forth, we also tend to aggregate them together as one group, but we know that there are variations among these groups on a lot of metrics, and so there are also calls to disaggregate, which will increase the sample size that would be required. Yeah.
Hi. So my name's Emily Butler. I'm coming from GlaxoSmithKline. I'm a statistician. So in general, inclusion and diversity is something I work a lot in my spare time. So my question is more of coming from the industry perspective, incentivizing the sponsor. So for me, it's obvious. These are things we should do. It's good business, but it doesn't happen. And when a sponsor gets incentivized is when you go to a submission at the FDA and your study gets rejected because your study population is not representative of your disease population. So now you have to invest another X million dollars in redoing that study to show that it works in the disease indication it was supposed to be investigated in the first place. So you'd think that would be enough, but it's not, right? So I guess I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on incentivizing the sponsor to being thoughtful at the get-go instead of cleaning up the mess after.
So let me take a stab at that and then ask the panel, and then I think we're going to wrap up in a couple of minutes here for a break. So I work at the People-Centered Research Foundation, and we now are managing PCORnet, which is a very large clinical research network. And as an embodiment of our commitment to patient partnership, we now have adopted a policy where patients are partners with us at the get-go. So as we have an idea, we find patients who are able to participate meaningfully, and we compensate them even in the design of the proposal. So when we go to prospective sponsors and say, or sponsors come to us and say, we're interested in doing a study on X, we say, and that's great, we would be interested in entertaining that as a concept, but we have these requirements for meaningful patient participation. Is that okay with you? And the answer uniformly is, we really welcome and embrace it. But I think for it to really become a part of the DNA, we're going to have two things happen. One, that we have the evidence to show that that improves the outcomes of the research, which we don't yet have. And we need the FDA to continue to exert a pull function for that inclusion and focus on patient partnership. So I think that will help sort of raise the watermark. I'll ask if other folks on the panel want to respond to that question, and then Becky, maybe you can take us home.
I would just say, I think in our experience working with industry, which we've done now for many years, there is that same sort of conversation that happens at the very beginning that, we really have no interest in working with you unless you're going to be putting first the interests of the participants. And then also the insistence that everything is open access, so no matter what comes out of it, it will be publicly available. But I think beyond that, I would again mention that this measure that we've been working on for the last couple of years with some industry partners will be a sort of a benchmarking way of being able to say how well did you do based on the patient perspective or participant perspective with this trial, and having some data come from that. So it's still nascent. It's only just actually getting out there to be used in 2019, but the early work with it has shown that the information gained as a result with the industry partners we've worked with so far has been eye-opening, has given them an opportunity to pause and say, whoa, I don't think we thought about that at all. And this was, I think, just an opportunity for us to continue that discussion. If you're not asking every step along the way for some input, then you're missing something that's really very important. So,
I would say probably in terms of moving industry into partnership roles, I think it's not only involving a marketing effort, it's also involving HR, because HR is kind of geared to worry about their patient health and their employee health and how it all kind of interacts. So they're not only employees, they're people who need care as well. So I think if we can kind of wrangle that cross-disciplinary effort to make sure that when a company's getting on board as a sponsor, we'd like to talk to all of your stakeholders who can help contribute to this overall solution. So, just don't look at it as, hey, we're going to tell your people that they can participate or be here or at this location, and they're going to get a coin-operated Amazon gift card at the end of it, that's all well and good. But I think we should look at it as a different chance to emphasize in different parts of the company who's a sponsor how we can help the community overall.
Right. You know, for us, we're just building platforms that hopefully can be leveraged by organizations like yours to have just greater and deeper reach, broader and deeper reach to underrepresented populations. Someone on the panel mentioned that, maybe it was you, Shireen, that communities of color, underrepresented populations want to participate in clinical trials. I think that there is that desire. The fear is still there, right? I mean, there is still conversation about Tuskegee and what happened in Guam. That conversation is still happening, and it needs to be addressed, and it needs to be addressed, I think, in a forthright manner. But if we can provide the accesses to organizations like many of the ones that you guys represent in this room, I think we'll get there the participation will get there much faster.
I want to thank the panel for this and audience for this great conversation. I think there's now hope that the statistics that Kathy gave us at the very beginning might change, that we actually are beginning to do things which might impact that after all of these decades. We will do a wrap-up at the last session. And anybody who wants their thing in the wrap-up, let us know, because we get to do it. We have a break now until 11:45, so go get some coffee, guys.